Hello and welcome to the slightly late week 8 video here for social psychology. Today we're going to be looking at emotions. Chapters 14 and 15 both deal with emotions. One is sort of looking at the functions of emotions. Chapter 14 looking at that both as we're going to be looking at interpersonal functions and meaning inside, intrapersonal functions of emotions related to our psychology. And then in chapter 15, we'll take another look at emotions as they relate to different cultures and primarily focusing on emotional expression. So let's switch to the course book here. And here we are in chapter 14. And we end up, I talk about the idea of emotional intelligence, which is an idea that didn't start with Daniel Goleman, but he certainly popularized it. And what Daniel Goleman did is he interviewed a whole bunch of very successful people. Not a bad gig, just meeting with the most successful people in the world and arranging that. And essentially discovered that although intelligence and good ideas and looks and motivation and whatnot played a really important role in those individuals' success, what he found out is that their ability, a number of things that he called, that he took emotional intelligence. He said our ability to recognize the emotions in others, respond appropriately, recognize the emotions in ourselves, and manage them appropriately was a very, very important and consistent quality related to their success. So that was something that he brought to the front. Now, so we have this concept in psychology of emotional intelligence as a very important component of success, but we also have Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, and he goes a little bit deeper, and I believe he's probably talking about the same thing, where two of his intelligences break out the management of emotions into that intra and inter. So intrapersonal understanding and managing our own emotions, interpersonal intelligence, the ability to manage relationships and whatnot. And they all saw this as pretty vital. So as we move into the chapter, I introduce the concept of what are emotions, and we look at that root term from the Latin, which means to move. These are the things that move us. When we think of being moved by something, we're talking about that it elicited an emotion in us. So that's kind of where the root of that goes. And here we have, some more stuff about the heart and mind. And there's obviously read some history about, what the ancients thought emotions came from, where we thought our motivations came from. And then quickly we go into this basic division of intra and interpersonal intelligences, and that's where we're going to take off. So what's the use of these things? There's the ability to manage, looking at why is it important, particularly when children are small. When with children, they're all small, we encourage them to develop emotional intelligence, intra and interpersonal intelligence. We understand that emotions are a very important part of personal change. And I want to speak to this as a therapist and relate to you that when somebody comes in for counseling, they often have a principal issue that they want to deal with. And oftentimes that issue has to do with relationships. It has to do with some sort of conflict that they're having or thoughts that they're having or whatever. Something they would like to see different. So almost right from the get-go, somebody tells you, kind of get the story behind where somebody's at. And then, where do you want to be? Here's where you are. Where do you want to be? What journey do you want to take? Just like as if we're taking a trip to California. It's like we're leaving on this date and we're going to go this route and we're going to make it to San Francisco. So the same thing as in counseling. Where do you want to go? And they want to be in a different place, just like we want to be in a different place when we take a car journey. Now, that different place, we help define that very clearly. We look at what's going on right now that is off and how that will look different when we've arrived at that destination. And we might even plan out steps to take. And those steps, mind you, because behaviors are often built up over several years of practicing sometimes very negative behaviors, and we're looking at making a change relatively quickly, certainly not taking all those years to do that. We're looking at something that's pretty difficult for some people to make those changes, even though logically it's like, just stop doing these things and start doing these things, and things will probably work out. But yet, despite the fact that logically it seems so easy, people still struggle with changing. Now, the reason why individuals struggle with change is that's the whole field of clinical psych. Why do people struggle with it? But certainly motivation is a key factor. And here we see that word emotion again coming into motivation. We see the root words in there as well. And motivation plays a huge part. And as a therapist, it is very important for me to discover the emotional reason why a person wants to move from this point to this point, because the logic is not going to be enough. If the logic was enough, you wouldn't need me. You would have done it already, because by and large, when people have come to see me and they're talking about their issues, they know exactly what they need to do. They just can't seem to get it done. And that emotional component is let's say the battery. We're going to take your little Energizer bunny, your personal change, and we're going to put an Energizer battery into it, and off it goes. That battery is going to be the emotional content. So sometimes we might even play with this, what would it take for you to do something? And let's say, just imagine your own sense of personal change. Let's say you're a smoker and you've struggled with quitting smoking, you don't want to smoke anymore, but yet the addiction is still there. So the chemical part is there, the social part is there, the something to do part is there, the habit, all of that stuff, you enjoy it. You enjoy the smell, you enjoy the feel, the taste of it, all of that stuff. And you think about, well, what would it take for you to actually quit? And let's say, and sometimes when we look at that, we struggle with, well, there's this and all these reasons why I wouldn't quit. And I said, okay, well, let's just go right to the emotional nth degree. I have a button that is going to blow up the entire state of Maine. And as long as you don't smoke, I won't press that button. Is that enough emotional incentive? I'm not threatening that, but there's at some nth degree where the emotional component, or maybe I'm gonna blow up your family. Let's get away from the violent ones. I will give you $1,000 for every day you don't smoke. Wow! Suddenly, it's not that difficult to quit smoking anymore. You might struggle and like, oh, I'd really like one, but boy, I really want that $1,000. There you go. When you find the right emotion, now of course, therapists can't give you $1,000 to keep your behavior. You probably, if you had $1,000 a day, you wouldn't really be worrying about this. But the notion of change being connected to emotion is very, very vital. It's not just logic. We can't Spock from Star Trek. That part of the whole shtick of that story was his discovery of the importance of emotions in order for him to be a complete human being. It was just sort of like the underlying story of Spock in the Star Trek universe. So here we have this completion of ourselves, the ability to motivate and bring about interpersonal change, intrapersonal change is very, very important. The next function is when we interact with other people. When we have emotions, we express those emotions to the world. So here we have Rafael Nadal. I pulled this off the web, one of the greatest tennis players of all time. And he's expressing an emotion. Now, truth be told, he just won a point, because that's where I pulled it from. But I could have also said he just saw a bad call. And he is yelling at the ref, or is like, damn it, or, something like that. We don't really quite know. But therein lies the importance of us to be able to consistently, through our emotional expressions, send the information that we want others to have about our emotions, but also to be able to correctly read the emotions of somebody else. Now, if you were watching Nadal's game and you were pacing along, you'd have a clear understanding of what he was doing. He won a point, he's excited about it, and even though his facial gestures could be mistaken for anger, he's obviously like, yes, he just like nailed that shot. And so the emotional expression has been sent by Nadal to the audience, and the audience picked up on it correctly. So that ability to be able to sense emotional context is incredibly important in terms of our interpersonal relationships. In fact, we send those emotions out with expectations that the people around us are going to respond. If we're angry and frustrated, we will have certain needs that are not being met. If we're sad, we have other needs that are not being met. So maybe I'm expressing anger, and I want the people around me to first, maybe I want them to leave me alone while I'm getting over the frustration. Maybe I want them to say, hey, what's going on? What can I do to help? If I'm crying and I'm expressing that emotion, maybe I want to draw people closer to me and have them connect with me so I can feel comforted. So emotions send signals that then we expect people to respond to them. Now, the other aspect of, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in the next chapter, but this is sort of the crossover between chapter 14 and 15, and that is emotions allow us to communicate social norms. And we have social norms that dictate the ways in which we communicate emotions, emotional expressions. So I have this picture here. There's this young girl. You have mom who's giving her the talking to kind of thing. And I point out, the facial expressions are clearly guiding this child toward making better choices in their behavior. Maybe she did something bad and mom came up to her. And, if you've been one of those kids, you know the look, right? Your parents give you that look and you've crossed a line. You can maybe fudge a little bit, but mom or dad gives you that signal, and all bets are off. You've crossed a line, and that's an effect of social control. We use emotions to guide people down the path that we want them to follow. In addition, similar rules dictate how we actually express emotions. Under what circumstances do we express emotions? Let's say expressions of affection. Let's say you grow up in one of those families that's very huggy. So whenever people come, everybody's hugging and whatnot. And then you have a new partner and you go to their house and they're all like, nope, we don't touch each other, kind of thing. Just a difference in cultural expectations for how we express emotions. The emotions may be equally intense, but we don't demonstrate them in the same way. And so these are ways in which we experience that diversity. And we'll be getting a little bit more into that when we get into chapter 15. Now with chapter 14, the assignment is simply a quiz. No discussion for chapter 14. And I'm asking you to give me the definition and, very important, an example. So definition, get it from the book. Example, both of those, for a interpersonal function and an intrapersonal function. So the answer to question 1 is, how do I use emotions to manage my relationships with others? And then the second one is, how do I use emotions to understand and manage myself? And so I want the definitions of those and an example. And that will finish off chapter 14. Now, we continue right along here this week. We have 2 chapters again. I think for the rest of the semester we have 2 chapters each week. So chapter 15 deals with culture and emotions. So we're going to look at not just the functions, which are certainly culturally based, I mean, this is social psych, but looking at the effect of culture itself on emotions. So I go into this a little bit. I put in there about kind of relates to both. When we're young, we use emotions to gauge how other people are feeling about us, and it guides our behavior, just like I ended off the discussion in chapter 14 about it. And now in chapter 15, I start off with the attention getter, looking at autism. So autism sort of is the autism spectrum disorder. There are some people along the continuum of the spectrum that have difficulty expressing and receiving emotional signals. That's one of the ways in which autism expresses itself. Now, those individuals not only have that lack of capacity, but because of those misunderstandings, they send confusing signals and they misinterpret signals coming from others. They actually begin, the other loss is that they don't get that same effective guidance that we use to manage social behavior. So the social control aspect of emotional expression is less effective when people are on the spectrum. And so there's a little video there that talks about, it's an animation, and 2 individuals that misunderstand each other because of the ways they express emotions. And so kind of an important little sideline to what we're talking about here. Now when we start looking at the bigger, we're stepping aside, stepping away from our individual interpersonal use of emotions, and we're looking at emotional expression, the rules and regulations about emotional expressions in terms of cultures around the world. Let's say sort of 2 schools of thought that sort of are competing, I guess. So we have universalist and we have social constructionist. And the answer, just like nature and nurture, is both, right? So we can talk about these things not exclusive from one another, but to what degree is something universal and to what degree is something socially constructed. So let's look at those terms themselves. So universalists believe that emotional expressions and facial expressions and lots of the inner experience, the heart rate, the sweating, the whatever goes along with what emotion you're having are universally felt by the human mammal, that we're all experiencing these emotions in the same way. The social constructionists step in and say, but there's some diversity that exists because of the cultural norms in terms of expression, in terms of interpreting the meaning of those emotions and whatnot. And so both of these things are active at the same time. So when we're talking about emotions from a cultural point of view, we are taking both the universalist, what's shared by everybody, and then the social constructionist, how is this part of our specific culture. Now the social construction, just a little side with that. Social construction is kind of like the prevailing cognitive model of how we begin to understand the world, or in sociology specifically, how we would generate our sociological imagination. We pick up cues from around us, and our brains actively construct internal models of the external world and how we understand them. And we manipulate those models in various ways. And depending on our developmental stage, we can manipulate them in different ways. Now we see that all the way back to any study that you might have done with Piaget, and the assimilation of new information and the accommodation of existing information based on new information that's coming in. That's the same process. It's kind of prevailing cognitive model here about how we interpret the world, and here we're applying it to how do we use emotions and the regulations for expressing emotions to understand what we're supposed to do in our social world. So by and large, the authors of this particular chapter focus on a dichotomy of cultures within the world. Now, need to understand that when we kind of explain and teach these things, we kind of push everything to the extreme so we can highlight the differences between these cultures. But we're talking about a continuum, just like in autism spectrum disorder, we're talking about a continuum. So all kinds of differences along the way, but the book really gets into the idea of categorizing cultures as either individualistic, with a focus on the individual and individual experience of emotions, and interpreting those from an individual standpoint, much like we were just talking about in chapter 14. And then collectivist cultures, which are different in that the primary focus is more associations with other people, relationships, the family, work group, and all that stuff become the focus of psychological decision making. Now, I'm teaching a class that's in the United States. I grew up in the West, and the truth is, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around that collectivist mentality completely. We can imagine, because we're smart and we have formal operational thinking, we can imagine about things that we've never experienced, but it is a very different upbringing for an individual to have grown up in a collectivist culture. And as we go through each one of these, I'm going to be asking you, are you more Western, which is individualistic in how you process these, or are you more Eastern? Now, let's also be mindful that there's a sort of movement, I guess, a movement to move toward more collectivism, to be less selfish and less oriented to the self. That's and we value those things. We may reject aspects of our own culture that are individualistic and self-oriented in favor of more Eastern type tendencies toward collectivism and caring for other people, and that's completely valuable. But each one of us will probably find ourselves somewhere along there. Just be mindful that it's a little tempting to kind of like say I'm more collectivist than I might be, than I might really be. If you're really, really honest with yourself, you might say, I still have a lot of that individualistic aspect of how I deal with emotions. If somebody offends me, for example, I may very much take that in as a personal experience rather than being overly worried about the people around me who are watching me react to this situation. Sometimes you have to look at the example to reveal the truth of our individualistic nature, which is ingrained in our society in many different ways. But we all, somewhere along that, somebody be asking you to do that. To actually consider those expressions. Now, as we begin our journey in each one of the areas, each one of these, the cultural impact is collectivist versus individualistic. So here we have facial expressions. How do facial expressions, how are they impacted by culture? And we know that many facial expressions are universal, and that we can see somebody who's smiling and we kind of understand that they're happy. We can see them when they're disgusted, and we sort of guess those experiences and whatnot. But some aspects of the experience are impacted by culture. Now, I did some extra research on this, and there's a field within here called micro expressions, and they're tiny, twitches of the eye, or the lip goes up, or you look up to the left. It's all these facial expressions that are very, very subtle, and those who study those things have been able to attach those to meaning, and some of those offer variance from culture to culture. Okay, but the major emotions are essentially universal. Where we kind of go and our separate ways, East and West, is really the ability to manage a single situation in which we may have more than one emotion going on. Now, again, I'm going to refer back to when I was a therapist, and sometimes the topic of the issue. When we're talking about the emotions, let's go back to that person who's having relationship problems, and then they oftentimes, when we're teasing out the motivations for this individual to bring about change in their lives, we have to tease out opposing emotions. So the individual may care very much for this individual, but that individual is harmful to them. It's not a positive relationship. So they feel positive and negative emotions at the same time. And in the Western thinking, we need to resolve that and come to a place that's sort of a motivation. And we as therapists help people do that. The research sort of indicates that in Eastern societies, having two opposing emotions about something is more accepted, or it doesn't cause as much anxiety in those individuals. Another example that we might think of is, and I'm going to do a little bit of guessing here just to provide you with the possible scenario that we might see between East and West. Again, we're looking at extremes just to highlight the differences. A person close to you passes away, and you're feeling both joy and sadness at the same time. Joy that they're no longer going through pain, sadness because they're gone. Now, many people can manage that. They can, and certainly with the advances in understanding grieving and death and dying and whatnot, is that we're seeing that this is perfectly normal to have those two feelings. But accompanying part of that might be a sense of guilt. An individual might feel, as I put in the course book, that they would never say this, but I'm happy they're gone because I no longer have the burden of caring for them. That would seem heartless. It would seem, but it's true. It's part of the mix of emotions that a person is having, and we may feel guilt and we may struggle with that. Apparently, when someone is more collectivist and someone leaves, if the priority is that the family now can move on, or the family is less burdened, they can kind of balance those two opposing emotions much better, or it's more natural for them to be able to have those two emotions. Again, I'm being very prejudiced here by looking at those extremes. It doesn't mean that people from Japan don't struggle with guilt. That's not what I'm saying, but just one of those differences that we see. Multiple emotions for the same event. The other one that we see is, and this is sort of a big one, and this is, what is our ideal emotional state? What's our goal? And it's very clear in the West that happiness, if not euphoria, seems to be the goal that we are seeking. I want to be a happy, outgoing, kind of vibrant, sort of, these are very, very, look at how I'm acting. My eyes get wider. I'm doing, this is good. This is great. Do all that. Principally because in the West, my individual power is expressed by that. My ability to manage the relationships around me, my ability to manage my life is very much dictated by my positive attitude, my go-get-it attitude, my ability to motivate others, my energy level. If I can keep those high, we have very, very high value system associated with that. Now, consider a collectivist point of view where the ideal state would be calm. It is not the ideal state, I need that, I can be that, but my ideal state is to be calm so that I can be available and responsive to the needs of others. We value that too, but it doesn't get as much press, doesn't get as much lip service as the, go-gettings. There's way more business seminars on the go-get-it, set goals, achieve kind of philosophy than there is on the management systems of being able to remain calm and be able to meet the needs of people around you. Those are opposing viewpoints of management and leadership. Leaders need both, but certainly we get a lot more press for one or the other. The other area that we look at emotions is how we determine our own feelings about ourselves, and we see an east-west component there, where in the West we look at self-esteem. Self-esteem is the value system. How important do I think I am? Interestingly enough, very highly influenced by others in our life. Our Looking Glass Self Committee has a impact on that. That's that indirect route of affecting our self-esteem. Whereas on the east side, we have harmony with our people in our family. So in the West, I might be able to tolerate differences of opinion in my family, as long as I'm still feeling good, and that's perfectly fine. Whereas in the East, differences in the family may be a paramount stress for individuals who want to achieve that harmony among the people that they know. Now, then we get into the world of expression. And interestingly enough, we see that in the West, there's a philosophy of letting it out and being able to express your emotions, speak your mind, let people know what you're feeling, get those feelings out, otherwise they're going to boil inside of you and express in some dysfunctional way. That kind of. Now I'm going to tell you as a therapist, that's not always true. Even when Freud was doing his work and he was talking about defense mechanisms such as denial or repression and those kinds of things, that these have a function. There are times that emotional expression is not the thing to do. There are times when going over the emotional experience over and over in the process of therapy is not going to be helpful. And that's why I think seeing professional counselors for highly emotionally charged situations is very good, because they can help you tease apart what do you really want to say and what do you want to say. The risk of expressing your emotions without regard is that you may hurt other people. And I think we see that expressed, we see that consideration for others, that is a more of Eastern thought, coming out of, let's say, manifestations such as the 12 steps in substance recovery. So there's a point at which there's a step where you need to go to people that you've harmed and make good, apologize, repair, whatever you can. But there's a caveat to that, as long as doing so does not harm them, because they may not want to see you at all. And even though you're in the state of recovery, you're putting your life together, you're a negative influence in that person's life, and your very presence is more damaging than your apology is repairing. But the consideration in that step is that you don't only consider yourself in terms of my needs to apologize and maybe feel forgiven. That's a very selfish point of view. There's teachings within there that you can't even expect to be forgiven. Maybe the end of it is I've said what I need to say and I need to move on with my life while they move on with theirs. But always in the light of that Eastern thought of I express emotions, but I do so very mindful of how my expression will affect the people around me. And that brings us to kind of where we're at the end of this chapter, with a discussion and a quiz. And the discussion gets into a microanalysis. We see these social, cultural differences that we have existing in the larger culture, but it's always nice to bring those down to the culture of our family. Our families have norms, values, and expectations regarding emotional expression. And I'm asking you to share those. So consider expression in culture, discuss your personal experience in your family in terms of emotional expression. And if you've ever encountered other cultures. In fact, I had a very interesting experience when I was a teenager. I had moved to Guam, and one of the friends that I made very, very quickly when I was there, because he lived right down the road from me, was a guy named Jim, and Jim was African American. And truth be told, it was the first African American person I'd ever really talked to at that point. I grew up in northern Maine. And so this isn't an issue about race, but I went over and I went to their house for dinner, and I was aware of the racial difference, obviously, but as a kid, I didn't, it really didn't affect me. I don't think I was aware of it, obviously, but I was there I went there for Sunday breakfast one time, and they invited me to their church. I'm like, rock on! I'm a Catholic. I can go to church. So I went to what was really a arguably Southern Baptist church. Now I come from that Catholic background where you sit and you stand and you sit and then everybody's quiet and the Mass is happening, which I value to this day. Even though I'm not a practicing Catholic, I like that sense of calm and sense of. So I step into this church and the emotional expression blows my socks off there. Everything that you can imagine about Southern Black gospel churches was going on that island of Guam, and they had the band going and they're jumping around, and I was more so than moving to Guam, that really kind of like, wow, opened my eyes. I totally enjoyed it. I came back. I was totally uncomfortable, but totally enjoyed it. Came back and, I said, hey, Mom, the priest says we're celebrating Mass. I don't think he really understands the word celebration like I just experienced, but it was a very different sense of emotional experience. If you have an experience like that, either, you have a family that's, big on emotions, and then you went someplace and everything was demure, that's an interesting difference there. And finally, the last quiz, I want you to kind of assess how East and West are you, and provide some specific examples to justify that. So this is an essay where I want you to provide me with evidence using the areas of difference between East and West in terms of emotional expression and experience about where are you along that continuum. All answers are okay. This is kind of a good quiz. All answers okay. I'm just looking for you to be able to justify. Give me some examples. If you think you lean a little East, tell me why. Tell me sincerely why. If you think you're a little West, tell me sincerely why. And that'll be a fun self-analysis for you to engage in. So I hope you enjoy these assignments here at chapters 14 and 15. And I will see you in the one discussion board. And have a great week in this content.